The first introduction to dahlias probably for most people is when they go into a garden centre or a DIY store and see this huge array, and here's a selection of them of pretty pictures. The actual item behind there isn't that pretty, so we have to hide it with a colourful shot. Now, for most people, what this is selling is a dream of what's going to come. The reality is a small amount of work is required to achieve that. Now, in the garden centres you're going to find everything from single dahlias through to some of these which would produce giant what people would call dinner plate dahlias. We call them giant decks. In the packets is really a little gnarly tuber there, resemblance of a potato attached to the stem. The problem is what do we do with that, and that's what we're going to be covering later. Once these are grown, the other extreme is what we call field tubers. Now, this is one of mine that would have come out of the ground after a season in the ground and was grown from a cutting. So we're going to have to cover lots of extremes in there from cutting or tubers, but that's the other extent of it. You've got that or that. The practice with them is actually the same, and we're just going to have to work out how that's done. To the general eye, a lot of the pictures all look the same. It's just lovely colourful pictures of different flowers. The reality is that a lot of these are classified whereby their form, their size is already set, and that would be done by us or by the National Dahlia Society. And I'll just take you through the brief forms of there. This being a single dahlia, generally has 8 petals around the perimeter and a pollen bearing centre. The collarette is effectively a single dahlia with an inner row of petals between 1/3 and 2/3 the length of the outer. Some people like these, great for bees and good for pollination. I tend to prefer the doubles. Size wise and types, this one, Little William, is the Dutch call it a pom dahlia. I suppose we'd call it a large pom. A true pom is very rarely found in this form. When we talk about large pom, then it's that sort of size we're looking for the flower to be. These are disqualification rings, but generally in the garden they'll be around that size. Ball type dahlias, this one down on Royal is a good old variety, and those generally they can come in small, medium, rarely, and miniature sizes. Miniature being that size and small up to there. So it's quite deceiving what's shown on the packet to what the reality can be. Cactus and semi-cactus dahlias, generally called the spiky ones, can be some of the most pretty, especially with the blends on the picture, and they can come in all sizes from the miniature up to the large and even giant. Water lily forms are exactly as they sound. If a water lily floating on the pond, they're a half flower, generally spoon-shaped florets, and are very good for the garden. They don't have too many petals and are quite weather resistant. Some weird and wonderful ones. This would be classed as a multi-layered collarette in reality. They're very new to the scene, and they're like a collarette but rings upon rings. They can come from being half flowers to fully double, and they're attractive. If it catches your eye and it looks good in the garden, then why not grow it? This we would class as a fimbriated dahlia, and the ends of the petals are quite evenly split, and it creates like a frilled effect. And again, in the vase, in the house, they look pretty. Now, decorative covers quite a broad form. We have the general smaller flat petals like on here, and this would be a small or probably miniature small decorative, up into the giants. Now, you get no perception of size on the packets, but you can see from the giant deck there it's a lot flatter petal and a lot looser in size. Now, that would naturally be that size or larger. If you're using it for show work, a giant deck is generally larger than this ring. This is the large ring, so it shows what sort of size, and these would be of equal depth, or at least 2/3 the depth of the width of the flower. So when you're making the choices of what you grow, it's best to decide whether you intend to show them, in which case pick on varieties that have got some sort of credential and some show history, and maybe go to a specialist supplier for those. If you just want colour in the garden, then really go for what takes your eye, and bear in mind that these very large flowers will be not that tolerant to weather conditions. A real downpour of rain on probably 300 petals that are potentially 6 inches long, they can end up looking a bit of a mess. So stick with the smaller sizes, stick with the ones with less petals, and they will give you colour all year long. If you need to check, most societies, if you're showing at local societies, will have a copy of the latest classified directory. You can check your forms in there. If they're not in the book, then ask someone that knows for guidance as to where you would put that in the classes. But generally most of them are in here. If they're not, they soon will be. And use this as a guide. If you don't, you'll find you may be disappointed if you was disqualified, and we don't really want that to happen. Now the tubers come in obviously various shapes, forms and sizes. These would be the ones out of our Dutch packets, which to me resemble a pot tuber, what we'd expect from a pot tuber, one that's been grown in a restricted container. That's more than acceptable. It will produce a full-grown flowering plant. They generally suggest that you plant these direct into the ground. I would advise differently, and we'll show you that soon. You get some that are clumpy and gnarly, a bit like this. These have been stored well, the stem is nice and hard. This can be trimmed down if you need to. If you've got any fears of things like this rotting, then trim them. This has got through the winter now, and we're up to setting them up, and they've stored well. You get ones that are very fingery and wiry. These again can be cleaned up and trimmed up. Most of these tend to keep quite well, and I don't worry about trimming them up. It's just more work to do, but they would do when it comes to putting them in compost, because they can rot. You get others that have got huge tubers like potatoes hanging on there, and nice small hard stems that have stored well and they've been cut down. There'll be eyes all around here, and again the bit of soil's been left on there. I don't find it's relatively important to clean it up totally. That's enough, and it's stored, it's done its job. There's another one there, very similar. You can see that a piece of tuber has been broken from here, but again it's sealed and dried. When they don't store very well, and it's usually due to this fat stem, and when we grow them in the ground, the field tubers tend to have this big stem. Dahlias naturally have hollows. These fill with water and will often rot, and you can see the tubers now are really hanging there, the split, and there's no real strength in there at all, and that's not going to be any good, and that's fit for the bin. So we've either managed to store our various tubers through the winter, or we've gone into the garden centre and brought a packet of Dahlias. Now this would be the one out of the packet. The thing we must do before we get these into action, and I would suggest certainly for these that would be done about March time, is just to check it over. Now to check it over, trim it up, get it ready to go, you will need a variety of tools. Scissors tend to be the best ones, and anything that's damaged we just pre-trim off. It's better to take them off than it is to leave them on. And the fine fibrous roots serve no purpose, and can only potentially rot the tuber. The trick is getting them going before they can actually rot, because as soon as they go into wet compost, that's what they're going to be thinking of doing. So that's probably trimmed up enough. We've still got the stem. That could be trimmed down, but there's a tuber on that, and there's eyes on that plant that are likely to shoot. The packet would say plant this in the ground from March onwards. Personally, I would advise that you put it into a pot, something like that would be fine, or even that if it would fit. Go larger. We're just using a multi-purpose compost here with some perlite. You can use grit or anything similar just to add a bit of drainage into it, and we're just settling the tuber into the top, just like so. Don't need to really firm it down too much. Give it a little rattle, and just make sure that the crown of the tuber is not too buried. That's where it'll rot, and maybe lift it up. That can then just sit on the windowsill indoors somewhere bright, and it will start to shoot, well, we hope. Or it can go into a propagator or onto a heated bench. If you haven't got those facilities, a windowsill will be fine. Get it growing, keep it protected from the frost, and then you can actually plant that plant as a plant when the frosts have gone, probably about end of May time, early June. And that will bring you into flower much earlier than planting the tuber in the ground and risking it rotting. Now with our others, our field tubers that we've stored, the same applies. You will need more of an array of tools for this. Knives, secateurs, kitchen scissors are generally good, and we just cut off the label. It's been tied on there. We will need that, and I would personally cut the stem down if it goes, and that's still sound and quite dry. Now the same applies to the wispy bits. A lot of these you probably would have removed when you put it into store, but again, a check over and a trim, making sure there's nothing left on there or any damaged tubers. You can just remove them. A dusting of sulphur can be applied if you wanted to. I tend not to worry, I think that's fine as it is. I use these mushroom trays, and these are the same ones that we've had upside down with the tubers on for storing, and I use the same for setting them up. The same compost as well, with multi-purpose. Now I won't fill the whole tray up, but again what we're trying to achieve is the tuber with its stem nestled in the compost, and it can be just rested in, and the compost just pushed around the tuber. Again, you're not trying to ram it in, just trying to settle it in there, the neck of the tuber being exposed and most of the actual tubers themselves under the compost. That tray can then be filled up with potentially the addition of further tubers. There is no benefit in restricting how many. If they fit in there, put them in. Then when that tray is completed, that will go on to the soil cable or into a propagator. Important that you do keep labels with them, because if we don't know what it is, there's not many people who can tell varieties by leaves. Keep the label with them. Water would be sensible at this stage, just to lightly water it in, not too much, and wouldn't water again until it's into growth. The tubers have been on the heated bench now for a couple of months, and we've had a few cuttings off of these already, which has put us to this stage of being quite a nice green hedge.